Cyber risk has now overtaken financial risk as the greatest threat that we all face. In fact, the current state of cybersecurity is fairly similar to the period leading up to the global financial crisis of 2009. We need to act now to reduce the risk that we face before it's too late. One big risk is what I call CISolation, the isolation of the Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO. One of the causes of the financial crisis was the fact that most bank executives were entirely focused on profit and revenue and not on risk. Sure, these banks had risk managers, and some of them even served on the board of directors, but they were still outnumbered and isolated. Today, unfortunately, this very scenario is playing out in boardrooms everywhere. Executive teams are focused on profit and revenue as they were before, while the CISO is facing CISolation as he alone is looking at the cyber risk. Another problem that we have is that the tools that we have for measuring cyber risk are flawed. During the financial crisis, banks had different ways of measuring risk. Companies like Equifax provided credit risk scores for consumers, while ratings agencies looked at the big profiles of big organizations and assessed their risk and the complex derivatives of the products that they sold and bought. Similarly, today, firms have emerged that provide cyber risk rating scores. These use tools that are aimed at the mass market, and typically these are web crawlers that check externally facing endpoints for known vulnerabilities. It's a fairly crude method, but it's probably still the best way to address the mass market at low cost. The problem is, it's a bit like evaluating the fire safety of a building by looking at a photograph of the building taken from the opposite side of the street. At the opposite end of the market, where budget is less of a concern, we have large organizations that hire specialist firms to audit their cyber risk. But these organizations pay their auditors for the ratings that they receive. That creates the same kind of problem that we saw in the financial crisis, where supposedly independent agencies gave AAA credit ratings to securities that were actually junk. So, what about cyber insurance? Well, most companies simply don't cover it. Coverage is only about 40% in the US, about 10% in the UK, and elsewhere it's even lower. And unfortunately, we're finding that some claims are simply not being paid out. For example, several major insurers have declined to pay out for damages caused by the NotPetya ransomware attack a few years ago. They've said that it was a hostile, warlike action and therefore not covered under their policies. Most people don't foresee the level of contagion, and this occurred in the financial crisis. Bad home loan mortgages in the US seemed most unlikely to spark a global meltdown, and yet this was exactly what happened. There is a similar risk of contagion with computer viruses and malware today. As we saw with WannaCry and the NotPetya virus, we've never been so interconnected, and consequently, we've never been so vulnerable. What's more, governments are simply not going to be likely to step in and bail out victims of cybercrime, as they did for the banks of 2009. That's why we need to increase our overall level of cyber crisis preparedness. First, we need executive teams to understand the risk and to appreciate, rather than ignore, the value of the information and advice that they have from their Chief Information Security Officer. Secondly, we need to increase adoption of cyber insurance cover with policies that are appropriate for each organization and their risk position. Thirdly, companies need to pay more attention to cyber crisis preparedness. Scenario planning and realistic simulation exercises are essential for preparedness, and indeed testing and assessment are mandated under GDPR. For companies of any size, it's not a matter of if they'll get hit, it's more likely to be a question of when. And since the average breach takes more than 6 months to detect, it may well have already happened. This affects all of us, We as a society have to act now, otherwise the risks will continue to mount. And one day, we could be facing a global cyber crisis that's just as severe as the financial crisis that we saw before, and maybe even worse.